much. All right, welcome back, everyone. We are at the crisis point in any day's program, which is after a good lunch. And in a dark room with the lights on us up here, and you're all free to do with your next couple of hours what you want. I'd like to welcome everyone back. I'm Joe Miller. I've been teaching African history here, I shouldn't say here, at the local university down the road for some years, and I have always regarded myself as a great friend of Monticello and an admirer of all of the professionals who work out here. The amazing thing is that as many times as I have taken visitors up on the hill and parked in this parking lot, I had not had the privilege of being in this building before, and I want to say that I'm very impressed and appreciative of the fine facilities that they've created here and of their generosity in welcoming all of us this afternoon. This is a second panel. This morning we heard some amazing collections of data and considered some of the challenges of handling them statistically and then presenting them in usually web formats that are going to be accessible to the general user. The question then moved on to talking about crowdsourcing, which I think is everyone agreed, is the enormous potential in this and, of course, many other fields. And then at the end, I mentioned a website that several people have asked me about since then, which is an opportunity to begin to assemble the kinds of data that I suspect that many of you in this room have in your computers, in your files, and I think the amount of information on the people who were enslaved by name is going to be astounding once we begin to pull it all together. So here's the site that I mentioned. It is at Michigan State University. Some of you will know the name Gwendolyn Meidlo Hall, who scoured the parish records from Spanish and French New Orleans, Lower Louisiana, and compiled a named database of some 110,000 enslaved individuals from the late 18th century. So that's Gwen Hall on the left. And then her companion is current chair of the department at Michigan State University. For those of you who are not academics, Michigan State is the headquarters of something called HNet, which has been one of the leaders in digital communications among the scholarly communities. There are any number of listservs defined by ever more specialized interest groups, but they're working with this enormous digital capacity that they have there at Michigan State through HNet to build a crowdsourced kind of database so that if you have information, I hope you will contact them, and I can assure you that they will be delighted to hear from you. They already have, as I mentioned this morning, some tens of thousands of names of people who turn up here and there in a vast array of records. Of course, the Catholic parish records of baptism, marriages, funerals, and so on, or burials and so on, in the Catholic parts of the Americas are much richer than anything that we who ended up in the English parts of the colonies could even imagine. But I think what we are hearing this morning and what I think we'll hear for the rest of the meeting is how many individuals can be turned up, and you don't know how they will cross-reference from these many different sources until you put them all in a single database, and that's the project that you see on the screen behind me. All right, the session this afternoon is called Reinterpreting Slavery. And the point of having this session, I think, already arose in the discussion this morning, where the query was, you scholars sit around and do all your stuff in your ivory tower. What does that have to do with any of us? And I think that is one of the big questions we will continue to debate throughout this meeting. But the panel here is set to call your attention to new scholarly approaches to reinterpreting slavery. Now, contrary to the initial impression you might get looking at the array of my colleagues over here and myself coming from Charlottesville, the panel is not intended to be on Monticello. It is intended, Monticello may come up, but the idea is to open up onto the general trends in scholarship that are developing and that you may want to query any of us about as we continue into the discussion. We're going to go in the order in which my colleagues are seated from right to left. That's your left to your right. And so we will start, or Cinder, you're starting. No, Dianne, I thought it was Dianne who was starting. All right, so Dianne Swann-Wright has been at Monticello for a number of years, where she has collaborated with Cinder Stanton, who is next, in ways that will be familiar to all of you. She is now the founder and principal of Swann Associates, which is a museum consulting firm specializing in exhibition research, planning, and interpretation. So there's the plug. We're delighted to have Dianne back today, and she will be introducing her talk now.
Good afternoon, all. I won't say wake up, because I'm sure that you're much too courteous an audience to go to sleep on me. You'll wait until Cinder or Annette. Following the televised broadcast of Alex Haley's Roots, an American Saga, many African Americans looked to historians to provide public answers to their most personal questions. A national conversation began that could not be satisfied or silenced by John Blassingame's Slave Community, or Meyer and Rudwick's work, or Gutman's, or Genovese's, or Berlin's, or any other wonderful host of historians. Countless individuals wanted to know who they were, where they had come from in Africa, and if not Africa, then where in the regional United States. Questions centered on where their ancestors had lived and died and been emancipated. People wanted to know what life had been like and what this meant, not only for them personally, but to the formation of American society. A number of disciplines linked hands to push away misunderstandings and ignorance. My comments focus on how the public's need to know encouraged historians to seek out innovative ways to answer questions about earlier times and events that had long been overlooked. Slavery studies at Colonial Williamsburg, Monticello, Somerset Place, and the website Valley of the Shadow, to name just a few, provide examples of how historians answered questions that gave fuller understandings. And if you're at this conference, I am assuming, and I hope that I'm assuming correctly, that you have been to some of these sites, some of you work at some of these sites, and you know the path that historians have taken over the last decade or so to try to answer questions. How do we tell the public about what we know in terms that are understandable to them? When I was trying to answer this question for myself, I actually went back to my own notes, and I found an essay that I had written in the year 2000, and it involved a question that Jillian Golly had posed to me many years ago when she asked me to join the Chesapeake Slavery Steering Committee, the digital archaeological archive of Chesapeake's Slavery Steering Committee. And I delivered some of these comments to Jillian and others who were a part of that workshop. And the reason why I am sharing them with you today is because they were very timely then, but I think that they're also very timely for us today, and I think that you may get something from them. At least I hope you will. I began 13 years ago, saying this to Jillian. Last week at this time, I was in Washington, D.C., attending the annual meeting of the Association for the Study of African American Life and Culture. In the afternoon, I made sure that I had a front row seat at a roundtable discussion honoring the life and work of John Blassingame. John Blassingame, you remember, is best known for his 1972 book entitled Slave Community. He also authored a number of other books on slave testimony, African Americans who fought in the Civil War, and essays on Reconstruction. John Blassingame passed away on February 13th of this year after fighting and losing a long battle with a nerve disease that immobilized his body the last years of his life. I thought about Blassingame and his slave community as I drew my thoughts together to share with you this morning. Blassingame's slave community did not enter the world quietly. There were many people who praised his work and almost as many who found it deficient and lacking any real substance. Blassingame was criticized for leaving out slave testimony and for standing too close to Stanley Elkins and not talking enough about African influences in African American life. Blassingame took the criticism and soothed its stings with the understanding that what was between the covers of the book was not all that he knew about black folks. He knew that he had a real understanding of black culture and the lives it created. It was not just between the covers of his book what he knew, it was in his head. He went on to revise the book, issuing a new edition 6 years later. He also wrote a volume on slave testimony and published it too. But what he also did, and this is what drew my attention to him as I thought about what was going on here today, is what he did at Yale University while he was completing the manuscript for Slave Community. He was setting up one of the first and one of the finest Afro-American studies departments in the country, and he was using an interdisciplinary approach. He brought together people from different disciplines that understood different aspects of a people, who could talk about multiple meanings and contexts and perspectives. He did what we are doing here. What studying the African American community had taught John Blassingame was something that we now know and accept, partially as a result of the work that he did. It is not possible to understand a people or an event by looking at them from just one perspective, i.e. written records. And so we are here today, and I'm talking to you about working across disciplines, understanding slave life and culture, about what Blassingame knew, and what I have come to realize is what is easier said than done. I think that it is easier said than done for three different reasons. Because, number one, there are problems with language. Because, number two, there are problems with access. And because, number three, there are problems with style. Language. Let me share with you what I mean about language. The 4th of July here at Monticello is a very busy day. It is also a vacation day for Monticello employees. But on July 4th of this year, I left my home, drove through the heat, and reached my office, not a destination that offered fun or excitement for the day. I set aside this day to do one thing and to do one thing only. I didn't know it would take a lot more than one day. I was supposed to read and understand the materials that Jillian Golly had sent me. As a member of the steering committee, I, like the rest of you, had received thick white envelopes of information. When I opened the first one, I sat back in my chair, adjusted my eyeglasses, and decided that I did not understand anything that envelope contained, except the opening letter, which she had very beautifully written. I tried a number of strategies to decipher the authority tables that her mailing included, to no avail. After an hour or so, I picked up the telephone and dialed her office number, got her answering machine because, unlike me, she was having a holiday, and I said one word, help, I think that I probably also told her that she needed to meet me and talk about this project and what she wanted from me. We did meet, and she did explain the information that had so puzzled me before. I came to realize that in working across disciplines, language can be a barrier that impedes exchange if not addressed. And I think that some of you probably got a sense of that this morning. Access. Many historians are becoming technology gurus, and remember, this was 13 years ago. My graduate advisor at Ayers is considered by many to be blazing a trail in this area, showing others what can be done with computers and networks and data available to those both in and out of the academy. What I have come to realize through learning about his project, his new project, however, is that there are many different types of technology access. If we are going to effectively work across disciplinary boundaries, we are going to have to be mindful of the limitations that our own training provides. We must also be brave enough to learn yet another skill. Style. A couple of summers ago, now I'm really aging myself, I was in a seminar at the Carter G. Woodson Institute at the University of Virginia, and a bunch of scholars, all historians this time, were talking about technology and new ways of getting the information that we need in order to research and write. I shared something that I had noted about historians who had been writing for a long time, folks like Joe Miller. Something that I had also come to recognize in myself. We don't just get information. We get information in archives and libraries, on the web, and we write about it. We sit with the information for a while, sometimes longer than others. We get to know it and allow it to get to know us and the way our mind thinks. If we are working across disciplines, we have to be mindful that an archaeologist may not follow the same path as a historian, and that a historian may not have the same procedures as a botanist, or a biologist may have a different or a similar pattern than all of them, or one identical to one or more of them. It is not simple. It is complicated. Working across disciplines requires patience and tolerance. My father used to tell me that it is not how hard a person works, but how smart. I think that as we gather together to understand the slave life and culture, we need to remember this. We need to remember what John Blassingame knew, that the source of black life and culture is the African American people themselves. And so when we bring together these objects, these beads and bones and bits of bowls, we need to recognize that they all tell us something that, when added to words and other information about the people who left them behind, we come to understand that the people we study, in the ways we need to understand them in the ways that they understood themselves, which is really what we're trying to do, after all, isn't it? Now, Cinder and Annette are going to share with you ways that historians in the past decade or so have actually put this type of thinking and work into practice. Cinder's going to be talking about what we did with Getting Word and what she's also done with other research groups here in Central Virginia. Cinder.
No, I've been mentioned.
Cinder says she doesn't need an introduction to this group, and I think she's right.
I do have slides, but the screen is black. But,
No, there you go.
yeah, but that's not the right one. So how do I go back one?
Now, where's your...
There.
Okay,
Okay, but how do I get it to slideshow?
there you go.
Okay. That's my slide. It was the right one, after all. Okay. Are you all hearing me properly? Okay. It's wonderful to be on a panel with Annette, Dianne, and then Joe Miller. And I've come out of retirement to give this talk. And I want to go right back, please. Anyway, Monticello has what I think a lot of historic sites would die for, this incredible Jeffersonian archive of tens of thousands of documents, and I'm not going to knock that. I think it's a wonderful resource, but it's so one-sided. Jefferson has left us almost 20,000 letters. The enslaved people at Monticello have left us 12. Jefferson's farm book and his letters tell us about names, ages, locations, and occupations, but are virtually silent on emotions, values, and even talents, because most of the references to enslaved people are about negative events, unsatisfactory work, punishment, illness, and death. Slaves' labor, not their lives, are the issue in Jefferson's archive, and the human dimension is almost entirely missing. So to find that human dimension, we have to come at slavery from all different kinds of angles, and we're hearing about them in this conference, and that's what's so exciting. We have to widen the net, and one way to do that is through the Getting Word project, the oral history aspect of it that I thought Dianne was going to talk about, but she didn't. No, I'm sure it'll come up. Listening for the voices of the people enslaved here at Monticello by hearing the memories of their descendants. But it can also be found in the written record by going beyond Monticello, beyond the site, beyond the subject, in both time and place. And so I'm going to talk about two research projects that have been the most rewarding to me, that focus on the experience of those in slavery at one site, Monticello, and also here in Albemarle County. Getting Word took us out of Virginia and out of the Jeffersonian period. I found myself reading the OR that Scott talked about earlier and whole regimental histories, way out of my comfort zone. And the interviews with over 180 descendants of 12 different Monticello enslaved families took us all over the country. And the research initiative, the written record research initiative, led us to remarkable people in every generation to the present. I'm going to take one family as an example, and apologies to a lot of you who are so familiar with this material, but everything always comes back to the Fawcett's. Jefferson's records show only that Peter Fawcett was born in 1815, the son of Joseph and Edith Fawcett, the head blacksmith and the head cook at Monticello. That was all we knew from his records. But when Getting Word was begun, after a couple of years, we found a newspaper account. In this account, Peter Fawcett told his own story in an interview, a full-page spread in the largest newspaper in the country that had been neglected for a century. As far as I know, nobody had ever talked about this article. Fawcett was at this time a renowned Baptist minister in Ohio, and he told how at the age of 11 he was put on the auction block after Jefferson's death. Jefferson had freed his father, but his mother and 6 siblings were also sold. And Peter Fawcett told of the bargain his father had made with some of those successful bidders, that he would buy the freedom of his children when he had earned enough money from his blacksmithing. But Peter Fawcett's master refused to sell him. Peter's parents had to leave him behind in slavery when they left Charlottesville for Ohio. So an 83-year-old Peter Fawcett, Reverend Peter Fawcett, told the New York World reporter, "I wanted to be with them and be free, so I resolved to get free or die in the attempt." He twice tried to run away, and finally in 1850 gained his freedom and joined his family in Cincinnati. And Dianne and I set out for Cincinnati almost 150 years later. This was April 1995. It was our initial attempt to grope at and try to find information about the Fawcett's, Peter Fawcett, and his family. And we sought the church that he had pastored and found that it had been swept away by Interstate 75. But the congregation was still thriving. We went to the new church and talked to the pastor and saw a full-length, full-size photograph of Reverend Fawcett in the vestibule there. And the pastor advised us to talk to the church members. There is a lot of information stored in those minds, he said. And we did do that a couple of years later. And he told us how to get to the Baptist burial ground on the outskirts of the city. And it was an incredible thrill to see the monument, a tall obelisk, just like Thomas Jefferson's, with the names of Peter Fawcett and his wife and his parents, Joseph and Edith Fawcett, on it. Now, these were the days way before online public records. And so Dianne and our consultant, Beverly Gray, and I sat for a couple of days in the Cincinnati Library, pulling census indexes off the shelves, scrolling through microfilm. We hadn't even found the Fawcetts on the census yet. That's how primitive methods were back in 1995. And we did finally find them because they had been listed as Fawcett, F-A-S-S-E-T-T. And we found Joseph Fawcett, blacksmith, living and working at 15 Stone Street. By the end of our visit, we realized that our hotel room actually looked out on the street where the Fawcetts had lived. But now there was nothing there. It was just a wasteland of warehouses. All the dwellings were gone. One of the burning questions that Dianne and I had was, were the Fawcetts able to reunite their whole family and see all their children safe in freedom? And it took almost 20 years to get an answer to that question, and that answer came about because of the explosion of online resources, which also brought what I think is the terrifying prospect that there is an answer out there for every question that you have. So searchable censuses, city directories, cemetery records, newspapers, online maps, put all of them together, and we could see that before they died, Joseph and Edith Fawcett lived in the midst, literally, of their children and grandchildren in Cincinnati. All of them lived close to their parents, either in the same household or across the street or around the corner. So a combination of what's learned from public records and newspaper articles and oral history reveals incredible bonds of family. Various Fawcetts went back and forth from Ohio to Virginia to check on family members still in slavery. They shared their resources by living together, by working together. Joseph Fawcett passed on his blacksmithing skills to his sons, who worked with him for a number of years. And Peter Fawcett's freedom was finally achieved by the members of the family pooling their financial resources to purchase him out of slavery. So you might be wondering, well, what does all this that we're learning about people and freedom have to do with slavery? And I think a whole lot, because lives in freedom, there's finally a paper trail, demonstrates skills and talents and values hidden in slavery. We learn about who the Fawcetts were and what they cared about. We learn about how they would have felt about the severities of slavery, family separation, the disappointment of failed attempts at running away. And Peter Fawcett, a revered Ohio minister, was the same person as Peter Fawcett, a Monticello slave, but without the testimony of descendants and all those records, his abilities and contributions would be unknown. And all these family stories tell of strength, determination, and a real passion for justice that carried down through generations of the Fawcett family. In the 19th century, they were prominent in the Underground Railroad. They were on school boards, political and religious leaders, served in the Civil War. In the 20th century, they fought racial injustice and went to jail in the Civil Rights era. And the most famous descendant, William Monroe Trotter, co-founded what grew into the NAACP and confronted several American presidents in the White House. Made himself a real pest, which is wonderful. So the Fawcetts have become the centerpiece of the tour that is given at Monticello that focuses on slavery. And that's because we went beyond Monticello. And I just want to quickly talk about another research initiative I'm involved with, and it's also about going beyond one's site in space as well as time, and I think of it after this morning's session as kind of crowdsourcing at the county level. Working with local historians and researchers has had an enormous effect on my understanding of slavery. There's a local group here of researchers, historians, and archaeologists called Central Virginia History Researchers, CVHR, and they fit their research into their lunch hours or the wee hours of the morning and have tremendous knowledge and generosity, share all that they learn with everybody else. And we're currently focusing on the transition from slavery to freedom here in Albemarle County, and those first years after emancipation are just incredibly informative about what life was like in slavery. You see what people chose to do now that they could. You see what they did no longer did because they did not choose to, like women working in someone else's fields. And CVHR has discovered a way to break through that barrier of 1865 to connect present-day African Americans with their enslaved ancestors, and to go the other direction as well, to give people in slavery their names, their full family names, by connecting them to postbellum families. And we've got an NEH Digital Humanities Startup Grant to try to automate this process of making that connection. And it's still in its infancy, but it's on display in the Woodland Pavilion in one of the laptops. This man was Peter Fawcett's first cousin. They shared a grandmother, Mary Hemmings Bell, and he lived for almost a century on Charlottesville's Main Street. He was free all his life. He traveled over Virginia as a famous musician, highly respected in Charlottesville. People interviewed him all the time, and we interviewed his descendants. His wife and his children are in the censuses. And I thought we knew a lot about him and about what his life was like. But we had no idea of something that came to light because of the work of the people in CVHR, something that totally changed my perception of what Robert Scott's life was like. One intrepid lunchtime researcher went through some plantation records in the library, and it included slave lists, which he shared, and it showed that while Robert Scott himself was free, his wife and his children were enslaved. This is something we'd had no idea of. He had no control over what happened to his own family, and most of them were enslaved up to 1865. He did manage to eventually purchase his wife and 2 of his 9 children. This is his grandson, Jesse Scott Sammons, who's been in the news a lot. Those of you locally have probably heard that his graveyard is in the path of the Western Bypass. And Virginia's Department of Transportation has deemed the cemetery and Jesse Scott Salmon's of no historical significance. And they made this judgment without consulting any descendants, of which there are many, or talking to local historians. Salmon's father owned and operated the hydraulic mills, the commercial center of the newly freed African-American community near Charlottesville. That site is now under the waters of the Rivanna Reservoir. And Salmons himself was an educational and political leader, a teacher, principal of the local school. He was chosen as candidate for the Virginia Assembly in 1880. This is at the time of the biracial Readjuster Party. But his election was defeated by his own party members, the white ones, who decided that this was not the time to have a black man represent the county. So by the current standards that govern historical resources, Jesse Scott Salmons is insignificant. His house is of no cultural value, even though it dates from about 1850. And who knows? He may have risen to historical significance by our present standards had he been born white. He died in 1901, the same year as Reverend Peter Fawcett, and he's buried here. This is the graveyard in the path of the bypass. And it's only very gradually, as I was putting together this talk, that I realized I've been talking so much about things that have been dismissed or disparaged or even destroyed by roads and floods, churches, homes, and soon graveyards. But memories and the means to preserve them do survive. There is information out there. We need to go find it before it is too late. Thank you.
Cinder, thank you for that moving reminder of how present the past remains with us all. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Annette Gordon-Reed, who really needs no introduction. I'll remind you that she has moved on to the promised land of American higher academics. She's at Harvard University, where she holds 2 chairs, and I will introduce her as an American legal historian, whom we're privileged to have interested in subjects that interest us.
Thank you very much. It's very happy to be here. I'm always happy to be on a panel with Cinder and Dianne. Cinder has come out of retirement. We hope to make her like Cher, where she will go on an endless retirement tour that will go on for at least another 7 or 8 years. No, it's really great to be here, and the symposium, having a symposium like this is so timely. It's always timely, and it's wonderful to be able to see all of you here, so many faces and so many friends that I know. A few weeks ago, I'm sure all of you saw the reports about the discovery of the body of Richard III. It was one of the most electrifying things. It tells you about my life, but one of the most electrifying things that's happened to me in a long time. I joined Facebook about half a year ago, and I posted about that until my friends I know were sick of it. Every single thing that I could find about it. But it was so wonderful to think of the confluence of all of these things, of history, of one of the greatest plays ever written, and the skeleton right there on the front page of the New York Times. And what was thrilling about it was the combination of things that it took people to find that. Archaeologists working very, very diligently to uncover the grave. Almost didn't get it. Someone was building next to it, and a plumber almost destroyed the site. Archaeology, DNA testing that was done, mitochondrial DNA, with the happy circumstance of having a female descendant in every line from the time of from Richard's time, which is pretty amazing when you think about it, thinking about how long ago that was, to be able to track people down in Canada who had this connection to this man, but also historical records, because they told you where he was buried. Any one of those things by themselves would not answer the question. And they're now going on to do some more testing, Y chromosome testing, to make sure to sort of really nail it down, to make it conclusive. This is one of the downsides of DNA, I think, and I'll talk a little bit about this later on, is that you get this, what they call the CSI effect, that lawyers recognize, because people see things on television, and there's always DNA on television, and now people think that you can't prove anything unless you have DNA. And for most of human history, we have come to conclusions about things, wrongly and rightly, but we've come to conclusions without it. But it was a wonderful thing to be able to see all of those things together. And of course, because of my own sort of connection to DNA work, I got a lot of emails from people. My students said, "Oh, did you see this thing about DNA and all of this?" And so I thought about this, and to see how do you connect up the story of an English king with people who were at the opposite end of the spectrum, enslaved people. And of course, my work on the Hemmings family was very much influenced by DNA testing that was done on descendants of Jefferson, Hemmings, and Woodson family, and the Carr family. I'm sure all of you know this story. I published this book in 1997, and asking, and I think answering 3 basic questions. What is the likelihood that Madison Hemmings was telling the truth when he said that he was the son of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings? And I said that it's very likely. The second question was, what is the likelihood that Jefferson's family, legal family, was telling the truth when they said that the Carr brothers, and one of the Carrs, fathered all of Sally Hemings' children? And I said, not very likely. And the third question, what is the likelihood that a man named Tom Woodson was the son of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings? And I said, not very likely at all. And so I made these pronouncements, grand pronouncements, and walked out, and then heard that somebody was going to do DNA testing that might answer these questions, and sort of waited around for a year until that happened. And the results came back and corroborated what I said about Madison Hemings, justified what I said about the Carr story. I was really happy about that one. The Jefferson Hemings connection, that's fine, but the second one, because I sort of tap danced on that story pretty hard. And so I was very happy about that. And then the third question about the Woodsons, less happy circumstance. I remember calling up Dr. Foster. I'd not met him before, but after the testing was announced, I called him up out of the blue and introduced myself, and he said, "Yes, I know, I'd read your book," and blah, blah, blah. We had a pleasant discussion, and I asked him about the Woodsons, and I said, "Dr. Foster, do they know what's going to happen?" And I'll never forget, Gene was a wonderful, wonderful man. I could hear him chuckling, very taciturn, but had great sense of humor. And he said, "Professor Gordon Reed, nobody knows what's going to happen." And I said, "I think we do. I think we do." And he said, "They're grown people. They have made their decision, and I'm fine with that," because I was asking him about counseling, all those kinds of things. I mean, DNA is a wonderful tool, but sometimes you find out things that you don't want to find out. And so there is counseling that goes along with it. So we had this discussion, and then things went the way they went. And it was very gratifying to me because, on one hand, it was gratifying because, I had said these things, and I felt that, I wasn't, my view of things was not challenged. But it was also a little bit annoying because I really like the idea, and I think it's important. I mean, to be a little bit chauvinistic about reasoning, about reading carefully, looking at things objectively. I thought you could come to an answer through typical historical methods. That doesn't mean that we only use those things, and it's good to have DNA pointing that out. Some of how I felt about Google. I love, Fraser's geeky. I'm geeky in another way. I love research. I love to get in the archives. I love to do all those kinds of things. When Google first came out, I felt it was almost like cheating in a way. Did you just, you did too? Say, "No, this can't be right. This is the work of the devil." I press a button. I had to get on a train and go all the way down to Richmond and go through newspapers and stuff like that. And, it's like the suffering of the artist, whatever. And you just press a button and all those newspapers come up. So I like that kind of thing, but I still think something is lost with it. And that means I'm so old, I'd say that to my kids, and they'd say, "Yeah, what's lost?" They don't have any idea of what's lost, and they don't think of it that way. So I like the idea of all of these things working together. I like the new technology. I like the fact that in a particular project that I was working on, technology allowed us to see something or to confirm something that was very, very difficult for people. Because when they were talking about wills in the previous discussion, it came to me that one of the things that my first book showed very, very clearly, and I think sort of looms over all of this, is the role that law plays, not the role of law in terms of documents, but the way law makes people think about the world. What do you do? The central problem with enslaved people is when you have people who are outside of law, certainly outside of family law, marriage, children, bastardy, illegitimacy, all those kinds of things, you remove the sort of protections that law gives to everybody. The way law tells you how to think about things, it puts African American people, enslaved people, at a disadvantage. Because if you aren't married, if you're not a married woman, Sally Hemings can get a new father of her children every year. It doesn't matter because she's not married. She doesn't have the protection. And our memory and our understanding of what law does and how law shapes the way we think about things, she doesn't have that kind of protection. A married woman does have that kind of protection. To even speculate about the possibility that the child of a married woman is not that husband's child, it's an insult. You would never do it. You can't even think of it in those terms. So what does that do to African American people who are trying to find their history, to try to say something about their families when all of the protections that legal families were given were not available to them? So while I'm impatient with this notion of DNA, it is also something of an equalizer. It's something that can come in and equalize the balance, in the way people think about legitimate families versus so-called illegitimate families. So I like it. I'm ambivalent about it, but I know it's coming and it's very, very useful. But I have mixed feelings about it, even though DNA has been very, very good to me. The third thing I'm working on right now, talking about new directions, there's a man named Mike McCormick who's my colleague at the exalted place where you... Can't believe you said that, but...
you missed the irony.
I missed the irony? Okay, good, thank you. Great. Mike McCormick is my colleague there, and there's a man named Nick Patterson and David Reich, who are geneticists. And David and Nick work on the genome, but not for any historical reason. Their whole purpose is to try to move us toward the day that will come probably, long after I'm gone, when every single individual will have medicine tailored to their own genome. You will no longer take pills that are just sort of hit and miss that, works for some of the population, but it will be tailored to individuals. That's what they do. So they have all of this information about thousands of people all over the country. And one of the things that they take for granted is that there are no African American people whom they studied who don't have white ancestry. And they've never thought about this in terms of any kind of historical significance of that. Mike, well, I mean, what are you going, huh? I mean, I'm sure there's things, genetics, that they'd say, and they'd laugh because you didn't understand them either. I mean, that's not what they thought about. They have a specific motion. I'm glad that they are fixated on this because I want them to get this right. So they are fixated on one thing, and they were talking to Mike, and Mike has been talking to me, and we got together and we had a meeting about this whole question and what they have found, and large concentrations of Y male chromosome, European Y male chromosomes in the Mississippi Delta. And they say, this is, and they make the claim that this is just, it has to be, it's so thick that it has to be rape, is what we're thinking about. And the word that comes to mind, and it's fascinating, is that they look at this, the distribution of Y male chromosomes, because they can tell when it's mitochondrial, when it comes in from women versus comes in from men, European influence. And they said it's just like conquest. Yeah. It looks just like what you see on the British Isles, in South America. It's conquest. That's what it's about. And my friend Peter Onuf talks about Jefferson seeing slavery as a state of war from sort of an intellectual understanding about this. These geneticists look at this, and it's mapped in the blood of people, in the genomes of the people that they're writing about. So conquest is a part of this. You think about slavery in terms of an economic system, a labor system, but it's like war. And men do the things that they do when they're in war and they conquer a group of people. And it's clearly there. Heavy influence of Y chromosomes, very, very small mitochondrial. From white women are not contributing to the African American population, it's males. And I asked him, I said, is this like Genghis Khan and his brothers? Mm-hmm. You know, Genghis Khan and his brothers had a few wives and 1,000 concubines. And so their descendants, geometrically, I mean, a huge number of people on the Asian continent have your males have the Genghis Khan Y male chromosome. And they said, no, it's not like that. It's not like a handful of planters somewhere who are, because they're, the big guys, they're the ones who have all the women. It's not that. They said it's widely distributed Y male chromosome. So the stories of African American people about their ancestry, the stories of people like the man Pearson, who did the book about Jefferson and Monticello. After he did that, he rode circuit on the as a Methodist minister in the Southwest, and he said, it's common. It's so common, more common than people want to believe, to come upon a household, a farmhouse, and there's some white guy and a black woman there, an enslaved woman, and their kids. And so that's a historical story, a documented thing, but the science comes in and confirms what it is that they're saying, or corroborates what it is that I'm saying. Because, as I said, none of these things by themselves, necessarily answers this question. But when you put all these things together, and you have different people who have different tools to measure things, and you put it together, because after all, nobody lives in one. When we live biologically, we live historically, socially, all those kinds of things are going on at the same time. It makes no sense to separate them out and write them as a discipline. If you really want to reconstitute people's lives, you have to put all of these things together. And so Mike, David, and Nick and I are going to try to do that. I've contacted some people who have been doing work in the Caribbean, the same thing, the sort of patterns of admixture there, to try to see what differences there are, because historians may tell a different story about what's going on in the Caribbean versus the United States. Here, the blood can answer that question, how different it is, whether it's different at all. So the new directions that I'm thinking about, and the one that I will be involved in, will be ones that are interdisciplinary in that way, that try to bring all of these things together. Not so much at the family level. The Hemmings thing was just, one family. But I'm really interested now in thinking about it more broadly, thinking about it comparatively. And that's what we're going to do next. Thank you.
One thing.
Cinder. We've had 3 moving presentations, and far be it from me at this point to attempt to say anything systematic about the recent historiography. If questions come up, I think any one of us would be prepared to answer those. But I think now there will be a lot of questions, and I look forward to recognizing you in turn. When you begin to speak, please wait till you have the microphone in your hand, because the recording of the session depends on that.
I'd like to have just sort of a story to tell Annette that you might find interesting. My name is Phoebe Kilby, and just want to corroborate some of the things you said from a family that's not famous. But my family, the Kilbys, lived just up the road in Madison County from here. And I was doing research on, and they were slaveholders, and I was doing research on the family, and at one point in 1860, there was an older woman, and her son had a household, and they had as slaves a woman. And then, and I think she might have had a child or two at that point. So I didn't really put this all together, like you said. Didn't quite get it. But then in 1865, the mother, white mother, decides to get remarried. And her son sues her for the ownership of the slaves. And I'm sitting there like the sort of clueless white person going, 1865, doesn't he see the handwriting on the wall? Why is he suing for slaves? I was thinking about them. It's just economics. But I do have a descendant of my family's slaves that I have connected with, and she looked at it and immediately said, oh, they were his children. I just didn't get it. But it just corroborates there was a lot of this going on. A lot of families where white males were fathering lots of children. And I think sometimes it doesn't, for somebody like me, it didn't jump out. But for African Americans, it was completely obvious. And I think a lot of white folks don't really want to own up to this, but that it really did happen a lot in a lot of different families.
Well, it's interesting because it changes in some ways. It makes you think about slavery in a different way, that this is the ownership, it's an ownership of alien people to some degree, but sometimes it's the ownership of families or the ownership of people's families whom you know, your neighbors' families. And so it's very, very strange and very complicated situation. And it's very difficult for us to wrap our minds around the idea of having this kind of legal relationship with somebody with whom you have a blood relationship, which we typically think creates certain affective ties, certain loyalties and whatever. But the system is much more complicated and much, in some ways, I don't want to say more tragic, but the tragedy is even much more multifaceted, I think, for that.
Who else?
Wow. Oh, no.
Please.
Hi. Excuse me. So earlier we were talking about the Cinder Stanton said the current standards that govern historical resources, and we've been talking a lot this morning and this afternoon about data and how that comes in the form of, DNA, science, stuff, artifacts, and that's what a lot of people want to see as corroborating information, historical information for historical accuracy and all of that, documents, things like that, hard, tangible evidence. But then, of course, Cinder Stanton's talking about valuing oral tradition as well. It seems right now that there may be some devaluing of oral tradition going on. And I want to know if any of you think that, excuse me, there may be in the future a paradigm shift towards valuing oral tradition more so that we can start to corroborate these sorts of pieces that we already have with oral tradition, and maybe use oral tradition, like Cinder Stanton was talking about, in making sort of databases like we're talking about this morning, to connect pieces and parts of different people's oral traditions to prove things that we may not have been able to see through archaeology, documents, and the kind of things that people trust as accurate historical sources right now.
You haven't spoken about oral history yet.
I think that when you do oral history the way that we did it, the way that we strive to do it, it was never asking one source to stand by itself. It was always using different types of records to stand together, to be able to let us understand a situation. And I think that, going back to that research trip to Cincinnati, you had 3 people in an archive, each trying to get any type of information we could to support what we had learned from a written source was true, and to be able to try to understand the nature of that reality. And I can't tell you how rewarding it was. I remember that somehow, and I'm not sure if this is because of age or what, but Cinder would always put me with the directories. And Bev would go someplace else, and maybe Bev was the one who was doing the assignments. But I'll never forget when I would come upon year after year of people living together and living next door to each other and living, the next street over or whatever. But I think that that type of confirmation of the oral history is something that's just unshakable. And so I think that if you try to have that type of support, not because oral history needs it, but because it's there, I think that it leads people to understanding more of what the true pattern was. And the other thing is that oral history is really the favored method, or has been the favored method of transmission of information. And people didn't just do it because they couldn't read or write in some instances. They did it because that was the favored way of doing it, which goes back to the whole name of the project, getting word from one person to another. And I think that when you realize that that's true, then it's a lot harder to devalue it unless you're devaluing the person.
And can I jump in here and say something that you always told me early on, Dianne? You had to tell me these things over and over again till I got it. But an oral history interview is another part of the historical record, and we evaluate it in the same way as historians, in the same way as we evaluate a newspaper article or a Jefferson letter. You evaluate them all together, and so I think oral history is increasingly valued, I would say, and will be more so.
Right.
Yeah, I think you're right. If I could jump in here, it's evaluation of all kinds of evidence, the kind that has to go on, the corroboration that we're talking about. Anybody can say anything. And the question is, what outside of that statement exists to support what the person is saying? And I really do want to add to this, is that it depends on what it is the person is talking about. There are some things that require more, for all kinds of reasons, corroboration and more evidence than others. Certainly that's been the case in the situation with my work. I mean, if I had been writing about Tom Smith and Sally Jones, who would care, right? In terms of what level of evidence that's required. So the more there's at stake, and this is what the point I was making about law and the way we view reality and power. It really matters what you're saying, and there's sort of double standards for evidence about how things are treated. So, but I do think you're absolutely right. I mean, all of this stuff has to be evaluated according to what supports it, and whether, for oral history, for me, the chief value of written documents, to the extent that they have take precedence or they have a value, is that it sets the story in place. Right? If someone writes a letter and they say, this is the state of affairs. Ellen Coolidge writes a letter and says, Sam Carr was the father of all of Sally Hemings' children. Can't change what she said now. You can't say now, oh, it was someone else. If this had been a part of an oral history, it would have been easier. If they had never been committed to paper, it would be easier to switch to somebody else at this point. So that's the value of it. Oral history can be problematic to the extent that people find it problematic, is that the story can change in ways over time that it's difficult for people to discern. But a letter, if somebody says it, if it's written down, if somebody says it, doesn't mean it's true, but it does mean that it's set. You cannot 100 years later say they said something else.
Let me just add a comment from my own experience. I'm the Africanist in the room. I'm a historian of Africa. And I was sent out back in the day to do a dissertation in Angola, which was probably the single largest source of the people who were captured and sent to various parts of the New World in slavery, mostly to Brazil from Angola. And I was sent out because we knew there were oral traditions among the African communities there. And we had Portuguese documents going back into the 16th century. So I had roughly a 400-year time depth to work with, and my job was to confirm that the oral traditions were historical by using the Portuguese documents to confirm them, or vice versa. And the good news was that in a region where people had been fighting, trading, intermarrying, living together for 4 centuries, there was virtually no convergence between these two sources. That was the good news, because I realized that every historical situation has many perspectives, many aspects to it. And the oral traditions should not be asked to confirm the written documentation, but rather to add another independent, authentic voice, which, as Annette just said, everyone has demonstrated how you can use these sources critically on their terms rather than asking them to be like documents. They're not, and that's the good news. Other questions? Okay, you pick it up.
This is a question which ranges pretty far outside in a certain way where we've been here today, and if somebody wants to rule that it's too far outside, that's fine with me, and just go on. But one of the really encouraging things that I've heard over and over again, kind of as a meta-theme here, is how synergistic these various areas of work are, the disciplines, the organizations, all of that. And I find that tremendously encouraging, as I'm sure others do too. However, as someone who spent my working life in universities, it occurs to me to wonder how this synergy is going to be incorporated and allowed to be as transformative as it can and should be within established departments. Now, and that may just carry us too far afield, but this, you know, I wonder about this. I'm encouraged on the one hand, and on the other hand, I know how entrenched departments can be. I've been in one or two of those. And also, particularly looking at the next 10 to 20 years when we're in a period of retrenchment, forced retrenchment, because of public policy and because of budgetary issues and so on. I would be curious for anybody to hear anybody's comment about how you think in your particular experience or your particular situation at the moment, how this is going to play out.
And I want to accent what I'm sure was a carefully chosen word, which is synergistic, because you have to have independent streams of evidence and method to develop synergy between these two otherwise independent things. Does anyone want to offer a comment, any of the panelists?
Well, what occurs to me in my experience is, I don't know, obviously don't know how it's going to turn out, but I do know that people are interested, very, very interested in making that kind of synergy. And I think younger people, as people are coming along, they will be used to working in that way and will have those kinds of expectations. I know that there are, you know, the institution where I am, it's every tub on its own bottom. That was the idea. But they're trying to do something about that. We just started a new law and history program. The kinds of things that I'm doing with Mike and David and Nick, these are things that I'm doing on my own. I'm not doing it on the auspices of any, you know, department or anything like that. So I think it's starting out with just people wanting to do that because they realize that it's a way to make their scholarship better. But I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I do know that there are a lot of forces pushing towards that because that's what scholars, younger scholars in particular, people who are younger than I, really, really want to do because they recognize the value of it.
We, at the University of Virginia, there is a Mellon program. Do you know this Mellon program? Where they will give you some money to hire somebody, provided they've got 3 or 4 different disciplinary connections to get these isolated, zealous and jealous departments together. And so I happened to have the privilege of sitting on a search committee for somebody that we were interested in who was an environmental humanist and an anthropologist. That was fun. And the bright people are doing this kind of work. Other comments?
Thank you. I'd like to say something to build on what Annette just said. I just retired from teaching in the public schools in Annapolis, Maryland. And we spent quite a bit of effort, and continuing to, I'm sure, in the last few years changing our curriculum for our middle school students. And we are now teaching, especially to sixth graders, building into the seventh grade curriculum, the ancient cultures of Eastern Africa, really focusing on that. And then talking about the Bantu migration, especially the language aspects of it, to lead to the teaching of the triangular trade and such. Is this just happening in this area because of such a concentration of research in Virginia and Maryland? Or can any of you say, is this happening around the country?
Experiences from the public schools. Can
Could I just make a tiny response to a very specific one sentence? We have an 8th grader, Ann and I do, who is in the Chapel Hill, North Carolina public schools, which are, widely believed to be really good schools, and they are. The 8th grade social science curriculum, the only accepted answer for what was the cause, not causes, but the cause of the Civil War, it is not slavery. The correct answer is sectionalism. Go figure.
Well, you've all read about our experience here in Virginia along those lines. Can we get the microphone over on this side, please?
Six years ago, I was teaching high school social studies in California, and we were doing something similar. We were teaching the culture of different areas of Africa leading into the triangular trade. We did not start Africa with slavery. We started with the culture of the people. Absolutely. I now work for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I work in South Carolina at Drayton Hall now, and we are doing it similar in South Carolina.
You hear me? Okay.
You're good.
Do you think museums will begin to start reinterpreting slavery, like really reinterpreting slavery instead of just saying, well, the enslaved were here? I mean, going beyond just saying where they are and really talking about the experience of slavery. And is there any concerted effort to really gear towards getting African Americans to come to places that some avoid?
I think there are a lot of people. What?
I have 3 passes in my pocket. 3 passes. She was here. She was here.
Well, no, I don't have. I mean, I think there are many people here who have answers to that question. I'm not involved. I'm out of this.
Come on, share.
What?
No.
No.
You said you're not involved. I couldn't share.
Dianne had to explain to me your reference.
She didn't even know who Cher was.
No. You can,
go ahead.
Okay, I've got the mic.
Thing.
Okay.
Oh,
I'm
Aurelia, you can tell us.
I'm not sure how to frame this. I want to get back to some compelling testimonies that we all know about of slave boys who grow up and then they have testimonies of their time, say at Monticello. Speak to when someone gives a testimony, it's not something that they wrote, but someone else wrote it for them. And I've heard people say, well, that's biased because a white person wrote it. So are they really saying what the former slave person said or what? And when I think about Peter Fawcett, when I think about Israel, when I think about, those testimonies, can you speak to that?
Do you want me?
Well, how do you feel when you read Peter Fawcett's 1898 interview? Do you believe what he says?
I believe what he says. I personally believe what he says. I believe that the person is trying to write down Say, for instance, with Isaac's testimony, I think that person is trying to write. Because, for instance, Isaac's testimony, it's almost like hearing him talk because it's almost like phonetic, the way the person's writing.
Right.
But there have been others who said to me, well, that could be biased. I mean, he didn't write it, so.
Well, I think we have to be aware of that and keep it in mind when we read it. But when you read something like the two accounts, Madison Hemings and Israel Gillette Jefferson, both taken down by the same man, they're so different from each other in their style and attitude, and that it's clear that he's trying to represent them as best he can. Don't you agree?
Yeah, I think so too. It goes back to the question that you had before about all kinds of evidence. You have to evaluate it in some way. And for me, if not only are the voices different, but the substance of what they're saying, I mean, you decide you never know if people are telling the truth. I mean, when any kind of story that someone tells, whether it's a person you're talking to or something that you're reading, you can only evaluate it based upon other kinds of information that you have coming in one way or another that verifies it. And if you have somebody who is giving specific information, and when you go to other sources, and it's clear that the person who's writing this down would not have known that stuff. So at what point do you decide that you're just not going to believe it when you have, time after time, you're able to check off what the person is saying from other sources, that this is specific information they have, and information that would not be generally known. I mean, like when Madison Hemings talks about John Wales, the legacy. I mean, no one had John Wales's will and would know how these slaves were transferred or whatever. And so there are little bits of things like that you say, yes, there's no, you can doubt anything. Similarly, people who write letters, and I hate to keep harping on Ellen here, but when people write letters, the first time I read that letter and started thinking about it very seriously, I noticed that she's saying things in there to her husband that her husband would have known. And you're thinking, why are you saying that? He knows who Sam Carr, he knows who that person is. And so then you begin to question that. So any bit of information, whether it's, a recollection that's taken from, by another person, or a letter, people write letters strategically. So the skepticism has to be there about all of it. And so you can't just say because there's a weakness in this kind of thing that means you don't pay any attention to it, any more than you say that a composed letter, and you pretend that composed letters, particularly things that are written sort of a reminiscence and back in the day kind of thing, that's somehow in a completely different universe. They're both things that are worth skepticism and testing by outside sources.
And there's another Peter Fawcett account, supposedly in his same words, in a Cincinnati newspaper, that one day I realized, boy, this sounds familiar to me. And it was almost word for word out of a magazine, Muncie's Magazine article about Monticello. And did the man who listened to Peter Fawcett stick that in, or had Peter Fawcett just read that magazine? I mean, how do we know?
Yeah.
If I could just intervene one more time. This is not a problem that you who work in the United States have, because, of course, there's no direct slave testimony in court records. But in other parts of the world, you have this problem of slaves who are being represented in court, who are there, whose case is being made for them. And then you have the whole question of not only translating it from whatever the enslaved person might have said through their representation, but then putting the whole situation in terms that are legally intelligible to somebody who is entrusted with interpreting the situation in terms of law. There is fascinating, a graphic novel that has been published for African history, but I think it has wider interest than just for African. This is called Abina and the Powerful Men. And Abina was a Gold Coast woman who was suing in a British court in 1860s or 1870s for her freedom. And this story, the case record, has been beautifully realized. And so there's an instance of an enslaved person, happens to be in a British court and in Africa, but it raises all of these questions of what did she say and what was said for her, for other people's purposes.
I just want to mention one source that we in CVHR have found so illuminating, and that's Chancery Court records. You all, I mean, it's amazing because there's one, Jesse Scott Salmon's father, who was miller at hydraulic mills. He was called in to give a deposition in a case. He's under oath. Every word that comes out of his mouth is written down carefully by the clerk, and it's just an amazing education to read what he said. So they're all through the Chancery Court records.
I saw your hand again.
I think when considering narratives of people, also instead of just looking at the bias of somebody who is doing the recording, also to think about the person who is telling the story as well. Because if you look at something like the WPA narratives, perhaps somebody that is telling a story of enslavement of their childhood doesn't necessarily feel comfortable talking to a white person they don't know and telling them their complete story of their childhood or telling them intimate details about their lives. So it's quite possible they're omitting some things, not wanting to tell a full and complete story.
Mm-hmm. Same with family letters, though. I mean, it's he's a letter.
Well, this is hoping you can respond kind of collectively as a panel. But Dianne, you were mentioning, in your talk you evoked Blassingame and Genovese. I mean, I think if there's one thing we can say about current research and interpretations of slavery that sets it apart from, say, work that was done at that time, is its interdisciplinary character in many instances. I just was wondering in what other ways you kind of collectively as a panel feel that the work being done now marks a departure from some of those classic works on slavery, and what directions you see it moving in the future.
Well, I think that if Jennifer Morgan was here, she would talk about gender studies, for example. And I think that people are doing the exact same thing that we talked about this morning. They're casting a wider net and looking at not just single community studies, but regional studies, and trying to get an idea of what happened, for example, in the Upper South or in the Low Country of South Carolina. I mean, people are trying to be able to characterize the differences that time and place made. And they're using records such as the ones that you're creating to be able to really put teeth to what it is that they're working with. And I think that what we're able to walk away with is a much more realistic understanding. There are works that deal with gender studies that are not only interesting but certainly informative. And I think that the more specific we can get, the better. And I think that what we're looking for, and I often think of it this way, we're looking for sentences that we can use, for our interpreters. We're looking for clear statements of what went on, for example, in the Upper South in 1800, to be able to characterize what people did. We're looking for to draw from the work that Fraser and Jillian and Sarah were doing. We're looking for ideas of what people acquired and what they disregarded. And these are things that not only do historians understand, but the public understands. And they can walk away with those juicy tidbits that characterize what people did of long ago.
I also think that history rocks. It really rocks these days because more and more people in other disciplines are turning their attention to making a historical point with what they're doing. Yeah. Like Maureen McGinnis with art and the slave trade in Richmond and others. So I think it's only going to get more so. Yeah.
like David and Nick. I mean, they're these people who are completely doing something separate and thinking, how could we do this? How could we, work with a historian or somebody to help us use this material that we have here, because we think it has some application, but we don't. That's not how we write. That's not how we do things. But I think, for me, it's the greater understanding of the importance of comparative looks of the slave system. It's not just the United States and the South. It's the Caribbean. It's East Africa. The trade, just as in political history, it's we look at the United States as a part of a system. What is going on in the world at that time? I think the biggest difference is not the U.S. focus. It's understanding that there are points of commonality in other places, but even when they're not commonality, things that are different in other places can tell you a lot about your place. The contrast is, oh, we're doing that. Why didn't we do that? Or why do we do it a particular way? So I think that's the biggest, for me, the biggest change is the globalization, the more, the broadening of our understanding of what we have to look at. The slave system was not just here. It was part of an international system.
If I could extend that, the differentiation is not only here and there, it's also within.
Yeah.
So that you don't start with an idea of slavery, which is going to apply to everybody, but you start with everybody. Yeah. And you find the variety of experiences, the enormous diversity, and that was one accent that I heard in all the presentations this morning. And along those lines, I think the real cutting edge in the research that's going on now is moving towards systematic biographies, not just Equiano, or not just, we've seen biographies done by the people who are here on the panel, but all throughout the Caribbean, even in Brazil, some amazing, very humanistic studies.
Oh, it is wonderful as a way of sort of evening the playing field because of great man history. Biography of great men or the people who exercise power, that's the justification for writing about them. But here, the justification for writing about these kinds of biographies is that the people were relatively powerless, that these are the people who are acted upon. And since they don't have great acts, they're not passing laws, their lives become the vehicle for telling the story of these things. And so it's an interesting turn of events.
There's an amazing book about a man who was picked up in Dahomey in Western Africa because he was in an area that the very militaristic kingdom of Dahomey was capturing people and sending them to Brazil. And he was too good at what he was doing for them to leave him in place. He was a healer. And that meant that he could take a chaotic social situation, which was the circumstance, help people get through it. The captors didn't need him, so they sent him off to Brazil in slavery. And he landed in the possession of a Portuguese owner, where he went back into business as a healer in this chaotic world of mid-18th century northeastern Brazil, filled with slavery, filled with violence. And he succeeded again so well that his owner had to pull him out and move down to Rio de Janeiro in the south, where he went back into business again. And he succeeded well enough this time that he bought his freedom, at which point he became vulnerable to the Inquisition. They nailed him. They sent him to Portugal, where they put him on trial, which generated a 744-page transcript, which is obviously the source of this wonderful book that's been written. And he was condemned, not to being burnt at the stake, but to being rusticated into southern Portugal, where he ended up in villages where the families had been there. Now, unlike Rio, unlike Bahia, unlike Dahomey, where the families had been there forever. There was no market for his services, and he disappears from the record. It's a wonderful book, Domingos Álvares. If anybody wants the reference, I'm happy to give it to him, but it's a dramatic and very well-told tale. And it says a lot about the ambience of living with slavery and the violence. Do I see another hand?
They're back there's somebody back there, too.
The three panelists are, among other things, telling a story of a family. And it strikes me that there's a really interesting nexus there, because I'm not a historian, and I'm so appreciating learning about how historians think about these things. I am a member of a multiracial family that has learned about that's enmeshed in the legacy of slavery, and made me realize that the conversations that I've had, the decisions that family members of mine have had to make about who to see and who not to see, and who to include in what event and who not to include, are the place where the telling the history of slavery meets the road, as it were, meets the lives of everyday people. And noticing how little trends, patterns, and data had anything to do with that point of translation, of having to take actions as individuals and families, with all this legacy and all this story to refer to, but having to turn perhaps to beliefs and values and faith traditions in order to understand how to go forward. So right back into the gray is the way it strikes me. You know, lots of ambiguity and uncertainty, and having to hold all of that and proceed, in my case, as a family.
Did you, before you go, did you want to mention this? Yes. Oh, sorry. It went away.
The mic went away. Well, she'll bring it back.
There are, I think, 4 of us here from Coming to the Table, which is an organization under the umbrella of the Eastern Mennonite University's Center for Justice and Peace Building. And a very important part of the work that we're trying to do is bring together all kinds of people, but particularly what we call linked descendants, so descendants of enslaved people and descendants of slave owners from same places, same plantations, and use that plantation or family connection as a ground from which to learn more about history. So we need to tell the truth about who we are, as best we can tell the truth, and also to look for healing within our families, in the hopes that healing within families expands to healing within communities and within the nation, and really acknowledging the legacy of slavery in racism and white privilege. And we have brochures, and there are 4 of us, and we'd be happy to answer questions. And Cinder and other folks associated with the foundation have been very kind in talking with us and speaking for our groups.
Please.
In regards to oral histories and enslaved families, how well represented do you all feel that field slaves are showing up in these oral histories? I mean, so many of the oral histories are oral histories that relate to enslaved artisans, house slaves, but what about field slaves? Are you all finding some of those stories as well?
You want me to start? Well, in the Getting Word Project, and that's 180 people over the last 20 years, you're right. Most of the interviews we've had are with descendants of artisans or house servants, but we have to at the same time remember that those families weren't entirely house slave, field slave divide, that there were people who worked in the kitchen or worked in the house, but then also worked in the ground in the fields. So it's not all that, but this is one of the hardest components of the enslaved population to reach, to hear. Definitely. Do you want to say more?
Oh, I was just going to say that people pass on stories for reasons, and quite often, people did not pass stories on because they didn't want to be identified or recognized for a particular message. And I think that it's not saying that people who worked in the ground didn't have stories to pass on. It was just that they didn't choose to pass on stories that would have the keywords that interviewers might be interested in, or that might immediately connect with the people that we are setting out, or the place that we're setting out to study. One of the things that I've long been interested in is the fact that I believe that in reality, people went beyond the boundaries that we've set for them. All people who worked in the house did not just marry or associate with people who worked in the house. You had families that were made up of people with different occupations, and so you can't just say that we have stories from house servants or from craftsmen, because their stories would most probably be linked to people that they were worshiping with, marrying, playing with, associating with. And so we have to be careful in terms of how we distinguish those stories. And the other thing is that we need to realize that we oftentimes put boundaries on stories, and those boundaries aren't necessarily accurate boundaries.
I think we might have time for one last brief question.
I just want to follow up on what Prinny Anderson mentioned about coming to the table. I'm also a member and president of Coming to the Table, and I have all those brochures if you'd like one. But what's interesting about the situation of descendants of slaves and slave holders, or as we like to say, the enslaved and enslavers, who are connected through family, and they get together and start sharing stories, it becomes a different, or kind of to us feels like a new kind of way of discovering history. Because together, when you start sharing, you start learning things that you never thought were significant and related to your family's history, but suddenly are. And like a brief story is, I connected with the descendants of my family's slaves, and I was sitting down to a meal with one of them who happened to be a Baptist minister, and he said grace. I realized it was the exact same grace that my father said at the dinner table every evening. And suddenly you start seeing these family connections, things that have been passed down that relate to each other. Maybe this is made up in our minds, but it seems to connect us. And we found all kinds of things about our families that tell us that we're connected, that might not be in history books or part of any oral history, but it corroborates the evidence that we find in the courthouses and the census and that kind of thing. So it's an interesting way of maybe discovering history. I don't know if you would consider as historians it's valuable, but for us it leads to some of those things that Prinny was talking about healing and reconciliation, when you can talk about these things. So I have brochures for Coming to the Table if any of you are interested.
Thank you so much. Let me make one comment, and then I'll thank our panelists, and then I will thank all of you. Starting with the digital framework for the preceding session, there used to be a saying about data processing, which was garbage in and garbage out. And one of the things that I was impressed with this morning was the persistence, the dedication, the creativity that goes into making sure that what goes in there is worth getting out again, reformulated. The research this afternoon has not been digital, but it demonstrates the same kind of scholarly persistence. that produces the kinds of insightful conclusions. And then finally, and this is where I thank the audience for bringing such a humane sensibility to a question of what David Bryan Davis, of course, always has referred to as inhuman bondage. So I want to thank you all for what I found to be a very illuminating discussion, and particularly our panelists. Thank you.
We did it. It's over. It's over, Dianne.